Welcome back to the Lensless Photography Podcast. I am your host, Oliver Winegar. In this episode, we will be talking with Andy Metcalf about primes versus zooms. Roll intro music. So, Andy, are primes or zoom lenses better?
Primes are.
Really? We're
How
gonna
do you
have
like
we're gonna have a
this-
heated conversation right now.
How do you like this decisive new Andy?
Yeah, this is different. Okay, well, I guess we have an hour to talk about why you think that. First of all, what primes and zooms do you have?
So primes, I have a 24 millimeter, I have a 35 millimeter, a 50 millimeter, and an 85 millimeter. And
All
then
L series?
the 35 is not.
Oh, okay, that's the macro.
It's the half macro.
Half macro. Still macro.
I get testy about that. But the 24, the 50, and the 85 are primes. I also have an 800 millimeter prime lens.
It's the 800 f11?
It is the f11, and
wow.
we can delve into that a little bit, but the beauty of that lens is that the f11 is not the problem that you would traditionally think that an f11 lens is.
Interesting. Wow. Okay,
What about you? What do you got?
Oh, yeah, I guess I'll go first. So, my primes, I have a 28 millimeter f2. That I also have an adapter that turns it into a fisheye that you can put on it. And these are all Sony lenses. I hardly use that lens anymore. I used to use it a lot, but now I hardly use it. I have a 55 millimeter 1.8, like the Zeiss one, the Sony Zeiss one, and then an 85 millimeter 1.8. I have a bunch of film primes that I will adapt. Mainly that one that we talked about already, that Nikon 55 millimeter macro that I'll use for like studio stuff. And that's it for primes. And then for zooms, I have my 16 to 35 f2.8 G Master. I just sold my 24 to 70. It was actually kind of sad when I sold it, but I did. And so I sold that, and then I bought the 35 to 150 f2 to 2.8 Tamron that I'm still getting used to, but it's a crazy sharp lens as of right now. And my 100 to 400. Yes. What are your zooms?
My zooms, I have a 15 to 35, 24 to 70, 70 to 200, a 100 to 400, and a 60 to 600.
Oh, yeah. So you're set.
I've got the whole range covered, and then some.
Wow, yeah. That's a good setup. So let's get into like the details of why primes are better than zooms or zooms are better than primes. Let's start with sharpness wise.
Well, so primes are sharper. There's less glass, less moving pieces, and less stuff there is between the light and the sensor.
Yeah.
The less interruption there is going to be, and the sharper they're going to be. Then there's also the advantage that because they don't need to zoom, the focus can be geared around that sharpness. And if you need an extra couple of elements in order to correct for chromatic aberration or that sort of thing, that's not a problem because you don't have the moving pieces so much to get in the way of being able to do that.
Yeah. And you can even get cheaper primes that are sharper than more expensive zooms, which is pretty nice. Like you don't have to spend very much on a cheap prime to get a really sharp one.
That's true.
For the most part. It depends on
the case.
case.
And there's certainly less sharp options, but as a Canon shooter, Canon makes their Nifty 50, both in the EF and the RF version, and they are very similar in size and weight, which is tiny and nothing. And they are very sharp. The EF one is a little older, but it's really stinking sharp, and it's $126, I think, retail.
Yeah.
US. The RF version is even sharper than that, and it retails for $200, and they're crazy sharp. They're really, really good. Is it as sharp? Is the RF 50 1.8 as sharp as my RF 50 1.2L? No, of course not. For 1/10 the money.
Yeah, but it's probably as sharp as your 24 to 70, if not sharper.
Maybe.
Is the colors probably aren't as good, and the focusing's probably not as good, but sharpness wise,
it's going to be really dang close, if not the same, for sure. Just because there are so few pieces of glass in there, and so little is required to make 50 millimeters happen, that they can do that with a minimum amount of glass and a minimum number of moving parts. It's not stabilized, so you don't have that in the way either. And it is a very nice little compact lens that's really stinking sharp for $200.
So do you actually notice that a prime is sharper than a zoom, though? Like I know it is, but realistically, do you actually notice, though?
When it comes to my L series zooms versus my L series primes, if I want to get real picky about it, and I pull an image up on a screen, I can find it for sure. But when it comes to final product and printing, the difference is negligible. But that's also, we're talking about, very premium, very expensive pieces of glass in both prime and zoom varieties.
Yeah.
I have my favorite prime and my favorite zoom retail at $2,700 a piece, and they're both crazy sharp. Is the prime sharper? Yes. It's also brighter, and the advantages that come with that.
Yeah, let's talk about that, the difference of depth of field and f-stop between a prime and a zoom.
Sure.
So usually your best zooms will be f2.8. There's the rare cases like that, 28 to 70 Canon RF, that's a f2, and then like what I have, my 35 to 150, that's f2 to 2.8, so just at 35 to like 40 you're at f2, and that's really shallow for a zoom, but you can get a prime way shallower, though. You can get those, like you have those 1.2 primes.
Yeah.
And you can find the f2 primes for way cheap too, and tiny as well.
For sure. The f1.2 is like a stop and a half or 2.5 stops faster, or 6 times more light, however you want to figure it, than a zoom lens that's a 2.8, an f2.8. And so you have a huge advantage in light gathering. But then even that 50 millimeter 1.8, that's a stop and a half faster than the $3,000 f2.8 zoom that I have. I'm getting tons more light out of my $200 lens than I am out of my $2,700 lens.
Yeah. So why use a zoom then?
That's a good question, Oliver.
We're going to talk about that.
So I think the biggest reason to use a zoom is the convenience factor.
Yeah.
There are going to be certain shooting situations that require you to have to be able to zoom in and out with your lens because you can't with your feet. A prime example of that is last week, actually, Oliver and I went and did a photo shoot, a landscape photo shoot of some waterfalls. It was like a
Spring type
spring,
thing.
and there were some little waterfalls, and there were pathways that had been built through there that that you can walk around and see and take pictures from or whatever. But you aren't allowed to step into the water or into the vegetation at all. You have to stay on that path. And so in order to get the right composition of your subject, of whatever piece of that spring or that waterfall that we wanted, you really have to use the zooms to do that. In some cases, the right zoom to be at was 65 or 75 millimeters. And if you have a 50 millimeter, that's too wide. And if you have an 85 millimeter, that's too much telephoto. That's too much zoom. And so in order to get that in between space without having a prime lens at every 5 millimeters, you really have to have a zoom. You have to use a zoom. It's a little bit inevitable.
Yeah. No, and that's kind of why I use zooms more than I use primes, is just because it's more convenient. Is I do a lot of landscapes, and then even like the commercial like type stuff I do, it's just nice being able to go from wide to zoomed in on like your 24 to 70 or whatever. And so it's pretty convenient that way, even though you're not getting maybe as good of results as a prime, but it's still really good results. And usually those landscape shots, I'm not shooting at wide open. I'm at f8 or f16 or something like that. And I guess the commercial shoots,
Sure.
I will be shooting at 2.8 a lot of the time, so I just get the product in focus or whatever. But I've never really had a problem with needing something wider. But maybe that's something I need to do, is try using one of my primes and see how the results compare.
Sure. Which can certainly be more difficult because you've got to be able to, to move yourself or move your subject. And if you have the room to do that, then super. But if you don't, then it's what you have. And it's not that you always need that wider aperture either. I rarely shoot my f1.2 lenses at 1.2. I can, because they're tack sharp wide open. Those lenses in particular, which is not very common. Traditionally, lenses are not sharp wide open. You've got to be stopped down 1 or 2 stops before they're really sharp. But
And that is the thing with the zooms too. If you're shooting wide open, they're not as sharp. If it's in the center of the frame, it's usually pretty sharp. But you will
sure,
notice a difference when you stop down a little bit, though. So that's, if you're shooting a prime like what you're saying, if you stop down to 2.8, then you will be that sharp.
sure. And when you're shooting like if you're shooting landscapes, then what on earth do you need f1.2 for? And the short answer is you don't. But you also have advantage with that lens because while you're setting up your shot and you're metering and you're focusing, you have way more light coming in because your lens is a 1.2 as opposed to 2.8 or 4. It's easier for your camera to focus and focus correctly.
Yeah, but for a landscape, you could manual focus most of the time if you needed to, because the subject's not going anywhere anytime soon.
No, and that's true.
But
Even
for
if
other
you're
situations,
shooting, like if you're shooting
studio stuff, it would be nice.
Or if you're shooting a portrait, or like in the last episode we were talking about portraits. If you're shooting a couple, you're not going to want to shoot that at anything wider open than an f4,
yeah,
or even a 5.6, or
depending
maybe even an f8, depending on where you're at, what the situation is, what your composition is. But to be able to have the ability to focus on your subject at 1.2 and then let your lens stop that down to f8 to the shot, you are going to have better and more accurate focus.
Yeah.
And and ease of use with that prime lens. It's just going to be more work to set up because you or your subject has to move back or forward to, to achieve that right distance and that correct composition for what you're trying to do, which you can't always do, hence zoom lenses.
Yeah. So one of the things of why I do like primes more than zooms is because of the size, at least coming from my aspect. All my primes are pretty darn small, and so that's like pretty nice. If I'm just to carry one prime with me, like it and my body, or even a couple primes, I'll have a pretty light setup then, and it's very portable, light, and I'm getting sharper lenses, and then I have that wider aperture and stuff like that too, and so that makes it a huge advantage having that light setup. But for you, it's not quite the same when you're using your 50-1.2 or your 85-1.2. Those are just as big as your 24-70 or whatever. I don't know. What's the size comparison on those?
Size and weight of the 85 is about the same as the 70-200. Absolutely.
Which is
it's a
ridiculous.
It is, but it's so pretty.
Which is like, that's what all the Sigmas are too. They're huge,
and it's a kind of a physics requirement, physics-based requirement that it be that size in order to gather that much light.
Yeah. Well, Sony came out with their 50-1.2 that's smaller than the Canon, and it's supposed to be crazy sharp and just as good. I don't know if it's supposed to be, if it's better or worse actually, but never used it.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, but I've heard nothing but great things about it, and it's smaller than the Canon, so
sure. And that's fine. For me, I don't mind the size is the thing, but also depending on what I'm doing, I don't often carry my primes around. It's not really part of my everyday kit.
Yeah.
If I'm doing portraits, then yeah, I've got those lenses and I bring those lenses with me. But if I'm not doing portraits, the 85 millimeter specifically doesn't come with me. And that's in large part because it's absolutely a massive lens. And it's absolutely beautiful and I really love it. But, but it is big and heavy. And I've kind of recently wanted to get away from those big heavy lenses, and that's why I bought the new RF 100-400 zoom lens that's very inexpensive, very light, and very sharp, and why I'm selling my Sigma 60-600 because it's very sharp, but it's also very big and very heavy, and it's really difficult for me to use for a long period of time because it requires all the strength in both arms to hold it up, and I don't have the physical stature to stand there and hold that lens for hours at a time trying to take pictures of birds, which is really what it's for. And so it doesn't get used. And where the 100-400 weighs like a fourth what that 60-600 weighs, it's nearly as sharp, if not just as sharp. And then I also have that 800 millimeter that weighs a couple of pounds, and it's also very stinking sharp, in large part because it's a prime lens.
Yeah. No, yeah, for sure.
Even though it's f11.
Crazy. So that's actually been my thing with that new 35-150, and I've kind of told you about this, but it's super sharp. That's like after we did that shoot Saturday and I went and looked at the images, I was like blown away about the sharpness. But it's just a heavy lens though, and I usually am like a pretty big fan of having light as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But it's big and heavy, and so that's why I've had a love-hate relationship with it as of right now, and I've had it for a week, so I can't, I just need to spend some time with it. But it's heavy though, coming from a 24-70, and I had the Sony 24-70, which is even bigger than like the Sigma 24-70, which is even bigger than the Tamron 28-75. So it's like I could be using something way smaller and lighter, but I'm not. I'm using something heavier
Sure.
and whatnot. But I get these
But you can see with that lens why I love that 85-1.2.
Yeah. But whether it's worth it is what I will have to see, because that's who knows. But
Sure. Well, and sharpness is king, the old line. If it ain't sharp, it ain't worth it.
yeah.
Insert expletive here. But, there's definitely a trade-off that comes with that. Whether, do you want insane sharp, insane light gathering capabilities, as well as insanely shallow depth of field and some of the most beautiful bokeh you can imagine? Are you willing to pack around that beast of a lens in order to achieve those things? Or are you willing to sacrifice sharpness, bokeh, and depth of field and light gathering in order to have small and light?
Yeah. Which is something we all just need to internally think on.
Yeah. And it's definitely a struggle. And, and that's where the disease that I have, because I have gear acquisition syndrome, I have both. And in some cases, all three, because I definitely, I have those big, heavy, super sharp, super bright L series 1.2 lenses. And then I also have the zoom lenses, some of which are also very bright for zoom lenses, not nearly as bright as the primes are, but still very, very bright and very sharp and somewhat heavy. And then I also have the inexpensive primes, like the 50 millimeter 1.8, the 35 millimeter 1.8, that are just a few $100s and very light, but still pretty stinking sharp.
Yeah.
And then I most recently have started acquiring the inexpensive zooms, which, traditionally are kind of problematic.
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask you too, is would you rather, like, what's the quality difference, of cheap and expensive primes versus cheap zooms? Like, what would be better spent your money? Where would it be better to spend your money?
Well, it depends on how much money you have.
Well, if you need something cheap, though,
if you're looking to save money, I think your best option is the inexpensive prime lenses, because inexpensive primes are still sharp, where inexpensive zooms tend to not be.
yes,
And there's still the added work of zooming with your feet and the restrictions that come with when that isn't a possibility, but you're going to get sharper results from cheap primes than you're going to get from cheap zoom lenses.
yeah, and for the most part, except for crop sensor kit lenses, the cheap zooms are gonna be more close to the mid to high range price for primes. Like, they have, like, usually primes, they'll have like their, well, not always, they'll have like their cheap primes, and they're kind of like medium grade, and then they're very high end, or at least kind of with Sony and maybe the Canon EF line, that's how they had it. And so the cheaper zooms are going to be more close to that mid-range prime price, and then some of the cheaper primes are going to be even cheaper than both of those, and they're going to be sharper than those zooms too. And
For
so
sure.
that's where I agree with that too, is better to spend your money on cheap primes than onto cheap zooms. That's
For
what
sure.
I did.
I mean, I'm thinking of, the Canon line, because I'm most familiar with it. In the EF versions, you have in the zoom lenses, you have the 75 to 300, that's a $200 lens. You have a 70 to 300 IS, that's $500 or $600. And then you have the 70 to 200 2.8 that's an L series lens that's, $2,000 or $2,100 or $2,200 in there somewhere. And there's those three different grades. There's cheap, and that 75 to 300 isn't a terrible lens, but it isn't a great lens. And it's $200. I see them everywhere used for $100. They are literally everywhere. I probably have two of them at my store right now. And then you have that mid-grade, which is a really nice lens for $500 or $600, I think. But it's probably not quite as sharp as the $125 50 millimeter. It's not the same zoom.
I guarantee it's not. I am almost certain it's not as sharp. I'd have to actually, we'd have to compare it, but I'm sure it's not.
No, and I don't think that it would be either, just because that's the nature of zooms.
And there may be other benefits, again, like maybe some of the coloring or coatings or the focusing is faster or something, maybe. But sharpness wise,
well, and that particular lens, that 70 to 300, uses a nano USM focusing motor that is crazy fast. It's the same motor that they're using now in the RF line. Almost everything is that nano USM that's very silent and, well, not silent, but very quiet and very, very fast. Focus just seems almost instantaneous, with that nano USM motor. But yeah, that EF 50-1.8 is not only brighter, because that lens is like an f4 to 5.6 or something, 3.5 to 5.6. It's also, significantly less expensive and sharper. Do you have to zoom with your feet? Yeah, but you get sharper results for less money. The 70 to 200 2.8 L series, that's $2,000. It's probably, I'm sure it's as sharp as that 50 millimeter 1.8 lens. Still not as bright.
Yeah.
But now you're talking about 18 times the money.
Yeah.
In order to achieve that same level of sharpness.
Yeah. I think just it's better off to go with, if you don't have that much money, just get some primes, unless you really need the zoom. But that's some of my images. Right when I had my A7R2, I had that 28 millimeter f2, which is a $400 lens, and the images are still super awesome and really sharp and stuff like that, because it is, even though it is a cheap prime and there may be some distortion and chromatic aberration or whatever, but for landscapes it was great, and it's still super sharp and everything. But then I'll look back to some of the images I had with some cheaper zooms or whatever, and those aren't so great, because they, you can always sharpen stuff, but just the color and the sharpness is just not there.
Yeah, for sure. And there's the kit lenses that come with the less expensive cameras.
Yeah.
With Canon, they make an 18 to 55 that's really quite terrible. And the 55 to 250, which is only slightly better, but really only because it has better zoom. They're just not great lenses, but they give you this whole zoom range. You can, for $600 or so, you get a camera and both of those lenses, and what you're getting with that is the convenience of being able to stand in one place and take a picture of a landscape as well as a picture of
and
deer.
We talked about that in a previous podcast, and I said that's one of the worst things you can do for a beginner is give them the entire range. Give them a 50 millimeter 1.8 to start with, and then they can go from there. Then when they feel like they're lacking something and they need something wider, need something more zoomed in, they can get something from that.
Well, and that's true. What I'm saying is that if you're just starting out, camera to take pictures, then you have that whole range. Are those lenses kind of terrible? Yes.
But that's why I mean, there's a lot of photographers though that are starting out that want to get super into it and want to grow into it and stuff like that. But they still start out with that same stuff because it comes with it and stuff. And I wish the camera companies wouldn't do that. I wish they would come with a 50 millimeter 1.8 or some type of prime lens.
Well, and that's what's interesting is back in ye old days of film, your Canon AE1 program, which was the Rebel T7i of the time, came with a 50 millimeter 1.8,
which is sharper than the kit lenses they're coming out with now.
Yes, and part of that's because they're primes, or because it's a prime lens.
Yeah.
But what that really opened you up to right away was the world of shallow depth of field. And I think that that's what the problem is with those zoom lenses, is that they've given you the convenience of being able to stand in one place and take a picture of a lake as well as a boat on the lake without having to move, but you've eliminated the possibility of isolating your subject and whatnot. And when people come to me and they've bought this kit from Costco or whatever, and they say, okay, what do I do now? I hand them the 50 millimeter and say,
throw those other lenses away.
Yeah. Or give them to me. I'll, sell them to the next Joe Schmo that broke his and whatever. But stop using those lenses. Start using this, because of what this lens is capable of doing, even at $125.
Yeah.
It is far more capable of creating or allowing you to create beautiful images as opposed to just taking pictures. I have a family member that has one of those budget cameras. She has the Tamron 18-400, and it is a great lens for what she does, which is take pictures of her kids doing their whatever recreational sport they're doing, whether it's wrestling or tennis or cheerleading or whatever. And that's all she is trying to do, is take pictures for the sake of memories, not take pictures in order to create artwork to hang on the wall.
Yeah. In that case, it doesn't really matter what you use.
Right. And, and in that case, that's where those cheap zooms are still terrible, but the most useful is when you're not trying to advance anything or create good artwork, that sort of thing. The cool thing with what Canon is doing now with this RF stuff, of course, at this time, Canon does not have a crop sensor version of these cameras. They're all, they're all full frame cameras. They're all, prosumer level cameras, and the glass that they're making that comes with them, even the less expensive stuff, in the EF line, there were 3 different sets of lenses, where the RF, there's only 2. There's the L series stuff that's, some people say too expensive. I disagree, but
it is too expensive.
Well, it depends on how much money you have. But there's the L series stuff that's very expensive and very sharp and very good, and then there's the STM, which stands for stepping motor. It's their budget, quote unquote, line of lenses. But even those are very sharp. They're not doing the cheap stuff. The quote unquote cheap stuff that they're doing is still really good and really sharp for very little money. And they're, as for what I can see right now anyway, they're doing those 2 sets. They have the 100-400 that's like an f4.5 or 5.6 to 8 that I bought. It was $650. It's a pretty great little lens and weighs next to nothing, but still really sharp. And then they make the 100-500 that's a like f4 to 5.6. I don't know exactly.
To 7.1.
Is it to 7.1?
Yeah.
The 100-500? Okay. Well, there you go.
So I don't know what the shallowest is. I
a half a
it's a 4.5
stoplighter.
to 7.1.
But But it's the L series version of that lens. And I love the idea of greater reach that you get with that, but and a little bit brighter, but it's going to be sharper for sure. But it's $2,800. That's 4 times the money.
Yeah.
In order to get that little bit of extra reach and to get that half a stop of extra light and to get that extra sharpness that I'm not sure ultimately you're going to see a difference in.
No.
When it comes to print, even if you're going to print a poster and hang it on your wall, I'm not sure that 97% of people are going to be able to tell the difference.
Probably not. No. Maybe, but probably not. Yeah. So what's your favorite prime lens then that you currently have?
My favorite prime lens is the 85 millimeter f1.2L. It's just so pretty. It makes such a beautiful image and has some of the most creamy, delicious bokeh and such crazy sharp results.
Better be for the size of it.
Even at f1.2, it's crazy sharp. And, you know, is it an unwieldy piece of equipment? Sure. Do I carry it around with me all the time? Nope. But I do love it. I love what it does. I love what it's capable of. And in the certain scenarios that warrant that, I am more than happy to take on the weight of that lens in order to get the results that it creates.
Yeah.
What about you? What's your favorite?
My favorite prime lens. Probably my 55-1.8. I don't use primes as much anymore as I used to. But probably the most one I use right now is that Nikon 55 millimeter. But that Zeiss 55 millimeter 1.8 is just like, if I only could use one lens and carry it around, like that would be the lens to do it. Just because it's so light, so tiny, it's by far my sharpest lens. And it's just, I like kind of the range too. It's not too zoomed in, it's not too wide, and so it's kind of like a good medium. Like I could use it for all things portraits for the most part and whatnot. So I like it quite a bit. And that was actually my first lens I had for the Sony system.
Yeah. What about your favorite zoom?
My favorite zoom, like I stated before, probably my 100 to 400, just because I love to be super telephoto. It's just a super fun lens. And when we went out last Saturday, I was trying to just use that 35 to 150. And then I was like, oh man, Andy, I can't do this. And so I had to pull out my 100 to 400 just because that's almost always the lens I reach for first. And I do love my 16 to 35 also. That is also a beautiful lens. So usually I'm super wide or pretty zoomed in. So one of those two. What about you?
Well, so my favorite zoom is my 70 to 200.
Oh yeah.
It's such a pretty lens. It's the 2.8L RF mount. Light and easy to use, crazy sharp. And I just like being in that range. And maybe it's because 85 is my favorite focal length and it fits inside there.
Probably.
And that shoot, we went out shooting Saturday, and I started with my 100 to 400. I shot a lot of stuff with the 100 to 400, but my favorite shot from the whole thing actually came out of my 70 to 200.
Really? That's a great lens too, especially that 2.8 version. So do you use your primes or zooms more then? What do you use more, your 85 or your 70 to 200?
I use my 70 to 200 more than my 85.
Okay.
Just because the 85 is a very specialty lens.
Yeah.
There's a very narrow window of, I don't want to say usefulness, but there's a very narrow category photos that you would use it for in
Yeah.
order to take advantage of everything that it's capable of doing. And I don't do a ton of that, and that's basically portraits. It's a
Yeah.
portrait lens.
Yeah, and
And
you can use it for other stuff, but that's really kind of why they made that one. And the 50 one too is
sure.
for
And I
portraits.
really like that 50. I just like what the 85 does better. I like the compression that comes from that
Yeah, it's
focal
for
length.
sure feels more shallow.
Yeah,
So
that one shot that's my favorite shot from that whole shoot was actually shot at 70 millimeters, and I kind of wish that I had more like 60 millimeters, but I didn't have that lens with me because I could only have so many. But that's mostly why I think that that's my favorite shot, just because of the composition and the scenario where we were kind of stuck on those walkways and not able to venture off of those.
yeah.
That that in that situation, that was the best result.
Yeah.
Was with that 70 to 200.
So overall then, do you use zooms more than primes?
That's hard to say. I want to say it's pretty even, but part of that is because if I go out just to just to goof off, or if I'm going out and running errands or whatever, I really like to have my camera with me all the time, and we can get into that later. But when that's the case, I have a 50 millimeter just because it's the most versatile focal length.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's my 51.2, because if I know I'm going to somewhere that might warrant the use of that, then I'll carry around that heavier lens. Today, while I was out doing my thing, I actually took the grip off of my camera and put the 50 millimeter 1.8 on it.
Wow.
Just so that I had something very light,
manageable,
and much more manageable, and easy to carry around.
Yeah, might as well carry around a 4x5 camera if you're gonna carry around the grip with the 51 too.
Yeah, it can definitely be, it can definitely add some weight. Do I love what that 51.2 does? Absolutely. But if I'm mostly just out goofing off and doing something other than photography, and my camera is there as a secondary thought, as a secondary piece, then it doesn't warrant carrying around that heavier stuff.
And that's why I like those small primes too, is they're just more manageable for those situations.
For sure. And and the next time I do that, I might put the 35 1.8 on.
Yeah.
And just for something different, to be different. But it's kind of rare if I'm going to go out in that scenario with just one lens on my camera. It's pretty rare that I do that with a zoom.
Yeah. No, and that's kind of how I am. Usually if I just could only have one lens, like what I said, it'd just be my 55 millimeter 1.8. But that could also be replaced for a 24 to 70, which I don't have right now. But in the past, those two lenses could I could take one or leave one. But overall, I for sure use zooms way more than primes. I hardly touch my primes now. Here and there. Again, like if I'm doing studio stuff, I'll use that macro lens, but not very often I use primes. And I should use them more. Like I should use that 28 millimeter for astro stuff more. I just end up using that 16 to 35. But that 28's like a good lens, and I get an extra stop of light. But I don't know, because usually I'll have in my bag just my zooms and that's it. So
yeah.
But prime, I don't know. I do like my primes a lot because they are small and they are light and they are sharper than my zooms. So
yeah. So there you have it. Primes are better.
Well, they're better, but I like my zooms more.
Yeah. Well, and like you say, it depends a lot on the situation,
Yeah.
and on what you're doing and what your what you were able to do, in a lot of cases, you're restricted in the movement that you can make. And in those scenarios, you need the zoom to compensate for that. And
Yeah.
and in those ways, having zoom lenses can definitely be a benefit.
Yeah, and that's why I like with like a 24 to 70 is I could go up hiking or something like that and I could get some landscapes to a little bit more zoomed in. And it's not like maybe I might not get the super wide shots that I love or the super zoomed in shots that I love, and that's kind of where that 35 to 150 comes in. But then I'm not getting the super wide, but you can kind of get a mix of both and just be using one lens. But
Sure.
or like my second option is I'll use my 16 to 35 and then an 85 millimeter, so it's still pretty light setup, but I'm still kind of getting both the ranges I like.
Sure.
But which one's better, primes or zooms? I don't know.
Well,
They're both again, like what you said, they're all so good now. It's hard to compare, and they for sure have their different situations.
For sure.
Okay, well, that's where we're gonna leave it. Why don't you guys tell us what you think is better, primes or zooms? Send us an email, or I'll put our emails in the list, or message us on Instagram. Let us know what you guys think, primes versus zooms. Tell us the situations you use them in, whether it's landscapes or portraits or wildlife or astrophotography, and let us know. Okay, everyone have a wonderful night.
All right. See y'all later.